That's not what it says, she whispered, and in that single sentence, the entire room stopped breathing. The words did not echo loudly, but they cut through the silence of the glass-walled private dining suite high above downtown Chicago like a blade sliding through silk. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the dark river, steady and indifferent, while inside, every conversation collapsed into frozen disbelief. Crystal glasses paused midair. Pins hovered above contracts worth $500 million. At the center of the room stood Jonathan Pierce, a 40-year-old white billionaire CEO in a tailored charcoal suit, his expression tightening as he looked down at the documents spread across the polished mahogany table. He was a man used to control, used to rooms bending to his confidence, used to numbers obeying his will. But tonight, something small had disrupted that control. Across from him, seated earlier but now slowly rising from her position near the service station, was Alyssa Morgan, a 26-year-old black waitress wearing a crisp black apron over her uniform, her hands still holding a folded service towel. She was not supposed to be part of this conversation. In fact, she was not supposed to be noticed at all. But her eyes were locked on a single page of the contract displayed on a large digital screen at the end of the room, her expression calm in a way that made the tension feel heavier, not lighter. Around them, executives and legal advisors shifted uncomfortably. The deal had been progressing smoothly just minutes earlier. A major international expansion between Pierce Global Holdings and a consortium of Japanese partners, a contract that promised access to new markets worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Handshakes had already been imagined. Headlines had already been drafted. Yet now, one sentence spoken by someone no one expected was unraveling the atmosphere thread by thread. Jonathan Pierce narrowed his eyes slightly. "Excuse me," he asked, his tone controlled but sharpened by disbelief. A few people around the table exchanged quick glances, as if silently agreeing that the waitress had misunderstood her place in the room. One of the senior attorneys leaned back in his chair, exhaling softly as though preparing for an inconvenience rather than a revelation. Alyssa did not step back. She did not lower her gaze. Instead, she took one step closer to the screen, her voice steady. "The clause you are referencing in English is not aligned with the original Japanese version," she said carefully. The words landed differently this time. Not as interruption, but as precision. Jonathan gave a short, almost dismissive laugh, the kind of reaction that comes from a man who has never been challenged in that particular way before. "You are saying our legal team misunderstood a $500 million agreement?" he asked. The room shifted again, tension tightening like a pulled wire. Alyssa's eyes moved briefly to the Japanese delegates seated along the opposite side of the table. She could see their subtle discomfort, the way one of them had already flagged a concern that no one else had fully understood. "I am saying," she replied, "that the translation changes the meaning of ownership allocation in a way that does not match the original intent." For a moment, no one spoke. The city outside seemed louder than the room itself. A car horn echoed faintly somewhere far below, distant and irrelevant, while inside, the air grew heavier with something unfamiliar. Doubt. Jonathan finally turned slightly toward his legal team. "Tell me she is wrong," he said, not loudly, but with a controlled edge that revealed more than frustration. The senior attorney hesitated. That hesitation was enough. Alyssa noticed it immediately. She had seen that exact expression before in textbooks, in translated case studies, in late-night study sessions at public libraries when she was supposed to be resting after double shifts. The difference between assumption and accuracy was often hidden in hesitation. She pointed gently toward a highlighted section of the contract. "This phrase here," she said, "does not mean shared rights. It specifies conditional control based on external approval that is not reflected in the English version." Now the room changed. Not emotionally, but structurally. Lawyers leaned forward. One of them pulled the document closer. Another opened a digital annotation file. Jonathan's expression did not break, but something inside it shifted. Not yet understanding, but no longer certain. And in that fragile space between confidence and collapse, Alyssa Morgan stood still, holding a truth that no one in that room had expected to come from her. The room did not react immediately. It never does when reality begins to contradict expectation. Instead, there was a brief, uncomfortable pause, the kind that stretches thin enough for people to start questioning what they just heard. Jonathan Pierce remained standing at the head of the table, his gaze locked on the contract display, as if staring long enough might restore certainty. Around him, his senior legal team shifted in their seats. One attorney adjusted his glasses. Another leaned forward, scrolling through the digital version of the agreement with increasing urgency. Across the table, the Japanese delegation exchanged quiet words in their native language, their tone controlled but no longer relaxed. Alyssa Morgan stood still near the side of the room, her black apron now feeling heavier not because of its fabric, but because of the attention it suddenly carried. She had not raised her voice. She had not interrupted again. She had simply placed a truth into a space where no one expected it to exist. Jonathan finally spoke, his tone measured but sharpened by disbelief. "You are not part of this legal review," he said. The statement was not an insult. It was a reminder of hierarchy, a reminder of where people were supposed to belong. Alyssa met his gaze without hesitation. "I am not claiming to be part of it," she replied. "I am pointing out what is already written." The senior attorney cleared his throat and leaned closer to the screen. Lines of text filled the display, English on one side, Japanese on the other. His eyes moved back and forth, slower with each pass. The confidence in his posture began to fade, replaced by something more cautious. Uncertainty layered with recognition. "She is correct," he said finally, though his voice lacked the authority it had carried earlier. That single sentence changed the temperature of the room. Jonathan did not respond immediately. Instead, he took a slow breath, the kind that signals a shift from control to calculation. He stepped closer to the table and studied the highlighted clause himself. For the first time that evening, he was not being presented with success. He was being presented with a problem. Alyssa continued, her tone steady but precise. "The English version implies shared operational authority," she explained. "The original Japanese text assigns conditional approval rights to a separate governing entity. That changes financial control structure entirely." One of the international advisors straightened sharply. "That would impact revenue distribution significantly," he said under his breath. Another attorney quickly opened a secondary document, cross-referencing previous revisions. The sound of typing filled the silence like distant rainfall. Jonathan finally looked up. "If this is true," he said carefully, "then the valuation model we approved this morning is incorrect." No one contradicted him. No one could. The weight of that realization spread through the room in slow motion. $500 million was no longer an abstract figure tied to ambition. It was now a question mark attached to risk. Alyssa did not move forward. She did not claim victory. She simply watched as professionals far above her assumed level of authority began re-evaluating every page she had already read in minutes. The Japanese delegate spoke again, this time more firmly. The translator hesitated before conveying the message. "They are saying there has been a consistent mistranslation across multiple sections," the translator said. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, not in defeat, but in focus. When he opened them again, his expression had changed. The skepticism had not disappeared, but it had been replaced by something more dangerous to his certainty. Attention. He turned toward Alyssa. For the first time, he looked at her not as someone outside the conversation, but as someone inside it in a way no one had anticipated. "How did you learn this level of technical language?" he asked. Alyssa hesitated for the first time that evening, not because she lacked the answer, but because the answer had never mattered before this moment. "I studied it," she said simply. "After work." The room remained silent again, but this silence was different. It was no longer disbelief. It was reassessment. And in that quiet shift, the structure of the entire negotiation began to change. The silence in the room deepened as the legal team continued dissecting the contract line by line. What had started as a confident negotiation had now turned into a controlled emergency, unfolding not with chaos, but with precision and growing discomfort. Jonathan Pierce remained standing, but his posture had shifted slightly, no longer fully dominant, now more observant, as if recalibrating the entire situation in real time. Alyssa Morgan stood near the side of the table, her black apron contrasting sharply with the polished environment around her, no longer invisible, but not yet fully accepted either. She was still in that uncertain space between roles, where recognition had begun but authority had not yet followed. One of the senior attorneys finally spoke again, his voice more careful than before. If the Japanese version is correct, he said slowly, then the financial distribution model we structured is fundamentally different from what we approved. The sentence did not create panic. It created clarity. And clarity, in a room like this, was far more disruptive. Jonathan turned slightly toward the legal team. How did this go unnoticed? He asked, not accusing, but demanding structure in the confusion. No one answered immediately. That absence of response spoke louder than words. Alyssa finally stepped forward again, not into the center of the room, but just close enough for her voice to remain steady and clear. It may not have been unnoticed, she said carefully. It may have been translated in a way that aligned with expectations rather than meaning. Several heads turned toward her, not with dismissal this time, but with attention that carried weight. One of the international advisors leaned forward. Are you suggesting intentional distortion? He asked. Alyssa paused for a fraction of a second. I am saying, translation errors of this type usually happen when context is assumed instead of verified. The room absorbed that statement slowly. Jonathan studied her more closely now, not as an interruption, but as a variable that had changed the outcome of the equation. You are speaking like someone who has worked with legal frameworks before, he said. Alyssa kept her expression calm. I have studied international contracts and bilingual legal documentation, she replied. Not formally, but consistently. A faint shift passed through the room again. The word consistently carried more weight than it should have. It implied years, repetition, discipline. Things that did not match the assumptions people had made about her earlier that evening. One of the attorneys reopened the file and zoomed in on a specific clause. There is more here, he said quietly. His tone had changed completely. Earlier he had spoken as someone reviewing routine paperwork. Now he spoke as someone realizing the paperwork itself had consequences. This section modifies jurisdictional authority based on external regulatory approval, he continued. If misinterpreted, it could shift control of intellectual property. That statement finally changed the emotional temperature of the room, not into panic, but into seriousness that bordered on disbelief. Jonathan slowly placed one hand on the edge of the table. In simple terms, he asked, what are we dealing with? The attorney hesitated before answering. We may be dealing with a structure that allows conditional external control over assets we assumed were fully retained. The words settled heavily. Outside the glass walls, Chicago continued moving as if nothing had changed. Cars passed. Lights flickered. Life remained indifferent to the tension inside the room. But inside, everything had shifted. Jonathan looked at Alyssa again. This time, the question in his eyes was no longer about her presence in the room. It was about how she had seen what everyone else had missed. Why did you notice this before anyone else? He asked. Alyssa looked at the contract for a moment before answering. Because I was not expecting it to be correct, she said honestly. The simplicity of the answer created a pause that no one immediately filled. It was not arrogance. It was not accusation. It was perspective. And in that moment, Jonathan Pierce realized that the most dangerous assumptions in business were not the ones written into contracts, but the ones written into people's expectations. The realization did not stay contained in a single corner of the room. It spread gradually, moving from the legal team to the executives, from the executives to the investors, and finally settling in the space between Jonathan Pierce and Alyssa Morgan like an invisible weight neither of them could ignore. The contract, once seen as a finished achievement, now looked unfinished in a different way, as if its foundation had always contained a question that no one had thought to ask. Jonathan remained still for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the highlighted clause on the screen. The confidence that had defined him earlier that evening was not gone, but it had been replaced by something more careful, something that required thought before speech. Around him, the senior attorneys continued reviewing the documents, now speaking in lower tones, their earlier certainty replaced by measured analysis. One of them finally broke the silence. If this interpretation is correct, he said slowly, then the revenue control mechanism shifts depending on external authorization layers that were not fully disclosed in the English version. The words made several people in the room straighten in their seats, not because they were dramatic, but because they were precise. Precision, in moments like this, was more alarming than emotion. Alyssa remained where she stood, her posture steady but no longer unnoticed. The room had begun to acknowledge her presence in a way that could not be reversed. Jonathan finally turned toward her fully. You said you studied this, he said. Alyssa nodded once. Yes. Where, he asked. The question was not dismissive anymore. It was investigative. Alyssa hesitated briefly, not because she lacked the answer, but because she understood the weight it now carried. Mostly on my own, she said. After shifts. Public resources. Language. Practice. Legal reading materials I could access online. A subtle shift passed through the room again. The idea that someone could reach this level of understanding without institutional recognition was uncomfortable for some, undeniable for others. One of the investors leaned slightly forward. How long did that take you, he asked. Alyssa looked at the table for a moment before responding. Years, she said simply. That single word reframed everything. Not talent discovered overnight. Not a sudden miracle, but accumulation, discipline, repetition, quiet persistence in places no one was watching. Jonathan studied her more closely now, not as an anomaly, but as a pattern he had previously ignored. Why were you listening so carefully to a contract like this while working a service shift, he asked. Alyssa met his gaze directly. Because people assume service work means you are not paying attention, she said. But that does not make it true. The statement was not confrontational. It was observational, yet it landed across the room with unusual force. Several executives exchanged brief glances, each of them recognizing, in their own way, how often they had overlooked people for exactly that reason. The legal team continued reviewing the documents, now moving with urgency. One of them flagged another inconsistency, then another. What had started as a single translation issue was beginning to resemble a broader structural problem. Jonathan stepped closer to the table and placed both hands on the edge, leaning slightly forward as he scanned the revisions being highlighted. How many sections are affected? He asked. The senior attorney did not answer immediately. When he finally did, his tone was careful. At least 3 primary clauses and several dependent references. A quiet tension settled across the room again. Not panic, but recalibration. Alyssa finally spoke again, her voice steady but lower. This is why context matters, she said. If one section is translated incorrectly, it can shift interpretation across the entire agreement. Jonathan looked at her again, and this time the distance between them felt smaller than it had all night. Not physically, but conceptually. You are telling me this could have changed the outcome of a $500 million agreement, he said. Alyssa did not exaggerate. She did not soften it either. Yes, she said. The room fell silent once more. Outside, Chicago continued moving beneath the night sky, unaware that inside one glass tower, a single overlooked perspective had just altered the understanding of a major international deal. And for the first time since the negotiation had begun, Jonathan Pierce was no longer thinking about closing the agreement. He was thinking about everything that had been invisible until now. The room had entered a different phase of tension, one that no longer relied on surprise, but on consequence. Every sentence now carried weight, and every discovery forced the group to reassess not only the contract, but the assumptions behind it. Jonathan Pierce remained near the table, but his attention was no longer fixed on authority. It was fixed on structure, on logic, on the quiet, unfolding realization that what they had believed to be stable was still incomplete. The legal team continued to move through the documents with heightened focus. Screens displayed multiple layers of translation, annotations, and revision history. The earlier confidence in the agreement had been replaced by a controlled urgency, the kind that appears when professionals realize that precision matters more than speed. Alyssa Morgan stood slightly apart from the center of the room, but no longer at its edge. The shift in perception around her had already taken place, even if formal acknowledgement had not fully caught up. She was no longer being evaluated as a presence outside the conversation. She was now part of the conversation itself. One of the senior attorneys leaned back slowly, rubbing his forehead as he reviewed a sequence of linked clauses. This is more than translation inconsistency, he said quietly. It suggests that the interpretive framework was aligned incorrectly from the beginning stages of drafting. That statement changed the room again, not through shock, but through implication. Jonathan turned toward him. Explain what that means operationally, he said. The attorney hesitated before responding. It means the agreement we believed we finalized may not reflect the actual intended governance structure. The silence that followed was deeper than before, because now the issue was not just accuracy. It was intent. Alyssa finally spoke again, her voice steady but careful. That is why I checked both versions side by side, she said. Because relying on a single interpretation creates blind spots. Jonathan looked at her for a long moment. There was no interruption in his expression now, no skepticism, only focused attention. You are saying this could affect control distribution, he said. Alyssa nodded. Yes. Depending on how the governing clauses interact, control rights may shift under conditions that were not clearly represented in the English version. The legal team immediately began mapping those conditions across a visual interface. Lines connected clauses. Dependencies formed patterns. What had once looked like a standard agreement now resembled a system with hidden interlocks. One of the international advisors spoke quietly. If this is accurate, then execution without correction could expose us to unintended governance transfer. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, not in frustration, but in calculation. When he opened them again, his focus had sharpened. How long until we have full verification? He asked. The senior attorney responded carefully. At least several hours to confirm every linked clause across both languages. Jonathan nodded once. The decision was forming. Not emotional. Strategic. Then we pause final execution until verification is complete, he said. No one disagreed. The room accepted the instruction immediately because it was the only rational path forward. Alyssa watched quietly as the process shifted from negotiation to correction. She did not appear surprised. She had already seen the pattern forming long before others recognized it. Jonathan stepped slightly away from the table again, his gaze moving toward the city outside. Chicago remained unchanged, distant lights reflecting across the river, indifferent to the complexity unfolding inside the room. Yet internally, something had changed for him. The assumption that expertise was always visible had been quietly dismantled. Behind him, the legal team continued working, voices lower now, movements more deliberate. Alyssa remained still, no longer questioned, no longer dismissed, but also not yet fully integrated into the formal structure of authority around her. That space between recognition and role assignment was where she currently existed. Jonathan finally spoke again without turning. You identified something that multiple teams missed, he said. Alyssa responded simply. I noticed a discrepancy in alignment. The phrasing was modest, but the impact was not. Jonathan turned back toward her slowly. That discrepancy may have changed the outcome of a $500 million agreement, he said. Alyssa did not react with pride or hesitation. She only nodded once, acknowledging the fact without attaching herself to it. And in that moment, Jonathan understood something he had not expected to learn from this negotiation. Accuracy was not just about expertise. It was about perspective. And perspective, once revealed, could not be unseen. The verification process had now fully taken over the room. What had begun as a negotiation had transformed into a structured audit of assumptions, language, and intent. Every screen in the conference room displayed synchronized versions of the agreement, both English and Japanese, aligned side by side for direct comparison. The legal team moved with precision, marking discrepancies, highlighting inconsistencies, and mapping how each clause interacted with the next. Jonathan Pierce stood slightly apart from the table now, no longer directing the flow of conversation, but observing it as it unfolded. His posture remained composed, but his attention had narrowed to a single point of focus. Not the deal itself, but the structure beneath it. Alyssa Morgan remained near the side of the room, still in her black apron, still technically outside the formal hierarchy of the discussion, yet functionally at its center. The shift in perception around her had stabilized. She was no longer questioned. She was now referenced. One of the senior attorneys finally leaned back from his screen and spoke with a measured tone. We have confirmed additional structural inconsistencies, he said. These are not isolated translation issues. They appear to affect control clauses across multiple governing sections. The room absorbed the statement without interruption. It no longer came as surprise. It came as confirmation. Jonathan turned slightly. Explain the impact in practical terms, he said. The attorney hesitated, then answered directly. It means certain decision-making rights may not function as originally assumed under the English interpretation. The Japanese version introduces conditional layers that alter execution authority. A quiet pause followed, not of shock, but of recalibration. Alyssa stepped forward again, not into dominance, but into clarity. That is consistent with what I observed earlier, she said. The structure of the clauses depends on sequence interpretation. If the sequence is misread, authority shifts without being obvious in isolated review. Jonathan studied her carefully. This time, there was no distance in his expression, only assessment. You understood this from reading both versions simultaneously, he said. Alyssa nodded once. Yes, because context only appears when comparison is direct. The legal team continued working, now fully engaged in reconstructing the agreement's functional structure rather than its surface language. Each correction revealed another dependency. Each dependency revealed another assumption that had gone unchecked. The $500 million figure that had defined the negotiation now felt secondary to the system it was built upon. One of the international advisors spoke quietly, almost to himself. If this structure had gone live without correction, execution authority could have been interpreted differently across jurisdictions. Jonathan heard the statement clearly. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned toward the city beyond the glass wall. The skyline of Chicago remained unchanged, but his interpretation of what he was seeing had shifted. He was no longer looking at a successful negotiation nearing completion. He was looking at a near failure that had been prevented by someone no one in the room had initially considered relevant. Behind him, the attorneys continued refining the document structure. The room was no longer tense in the same way. It had transitioned into controlled focus. The urgency had not disappeared, but it had become productive rather than reactive. Alyssa stood quietly, her role still informal, but her influence now undeniable. Jonathan finally spoke again without turning fully around. How many times have you seen situations like this before? He asked. Alyssa considered the question briefly before answering. More than I can count in small ways, she said. Translation errors, misaligned assumptions, differences between what is written and what is understood. Jonathan nodded slowly. That answer carried weight not because of its scale, but because of its implication. It suggested repetition, experience, and attention built outside traditional systems. He turned back toward her fully. And yet you were the only one who identified this in real time, he said. Alyssa did not respond with pride. She simply stated, because I was not assuming it was correct. The room quieted again, not from interruption, but from reflection. The attorneys continued finalizing adjustments, but the emotional center of the room had shifted. Jonathan stepped closer to the table, looking once more at the corrected structure forming on the screen. The agreement was now clearer, safer, and more accurate than it had been when it was first presented. Yet the most significant change was not in the contract itself. It was in the understanding of how easily critical insight could be overlooked when filtered through expectation. He looked toward Alyssa one final time in that moment, not as an observer, not as a waitress, but as the variable that had altered the outcome of everything that had brought them into this room. The room had settled into a new rhythm, one defined not by shock or disruption, but by careful reconstruction. Every clause of the agreement was now being reviewed with a level of scrutiny that had not existed before. Screens displayed synchronized versions of the contract, with highlighted sections marking areas of uncertainty that required correction. The legal team moved methodically, no longer defending assumptions, but testing them against both language versions in real time. Jonathan Pierce stood near the head of the table, his presence no longer directing the flow of discussion, but anchoring it. His attention remained fixed on the evolving structure of the agreement, as if watching a system correct itself layer by layer. What had started as a confident negotiation had now become a controlled recalibration of everything they thought they understood. Alyssa Morgan remained near the side of the room, still physically outside the formal leadership structure, yet functionally embedded within the most critical part of the process. The shift in perception around her had stabilized into something more permanent. She was no longer treated as an interruption. She was now treated as a reference point. One of the senior attorneys finally leaned forward again, his voice steady but more cautious than before. We have completed a full comparative review of the remaining sections, he said. The core structure is consistent, but several conditional clauses require realignment to match the original Japanese intent. A quiet acknowledgement moved through the room. No one questioned the necessity of the correction anymore. The focus had shifted entirely to resolution. Jonathan nodded once. How long until the corrected version is fully validated? He asked. Several hours, the attorney replied. Possibly less if no additional discrepancies are found. Jonathan accepted the answer without reaction, then turned his attention briefly toward Alyssa. Stay with the review process, he said. It was not framed as a request. It was recognition of necessity. Alyssa gave a simple nod. Yes. The legal team resumed work, now integrating corrections across multiple layers of the document simultaneously. The atmosphere remained serious, but no longer unstable. It had become procedural, driven by accuracy rather than urgency. Alyssa observed quietly as sections were rewritten, dependencies adjusted, and control mechanisms clarified. Each correction reinforced what she had identified earlier, but she did not intervene unless directly referenced. Her role had shifted from observer to participant, but she maintained discipline in how she engaged. Jonathan stepped slightly away from the table again, looking toward the city through the glass wall. Chicago remained unchanged in its movement, unaware of the recalibration taking place high above it. Yet internally, something in Jonathan's perspective had already shifted beyond the immediate problem. He was no longer evaluating only the contract. He was evaluating how the contract had been understood in the first place. The implications extended beyond this single deal. They extended into how decisions were made, how expertise was recognized, and how often critical insight might be overlooked simply because it did not come from expected sources. He turned back toward Alyssa again. You said you learned this by studying after work, he said. Alyssa looked up briefly. Yes. Jonathan paused, then continued. And you were working as a waitress during that time. Yes, she repeated. There was no emphasis in her answer, no attempt to elevate it. It was simply fact. Jonathan nodded slowly, absorbing that information without commentary. Around them, the legal team finalized another set of corrections. One of the international advisors reviewed the updated structure and gave a quiet acknowledgement of approval. This version reflects the intended governance framework more accurately, he said. The statement marked a turning point, not because everything was perfect, but because alignment had been restored. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his attention still split between the document and the person who had reshaped its interpretation. He finally spoke again, his voice lower now. If you had not spoken up, he said, this would have moved forward incorrectly. Alyssa responded without hesitation. Then it would have been wrong, she said simply. The clarity of her answer lingered in the room longer than expected. There was no emotion attached to it. No pride. No exaggeration. Only certainty grounded in observation. Jonathan looked at her for a long moment, then turned back toward the table as the final adjustments were completed. The agreement was now structurally sound, corrected, and verified across both language versions. But the most important outcome of the night was no longer the contract itself. It was the realization that understanding is only as complete as the perspective used to form it. And in that realization, Alyssa Morgan had already changed the way every person in that room would evaluate expertise moving forward. The final stage of verification had completed quietly, without ceremony, without announcement, but with consequences that were immediately understood by everyone still present in the room. The corrected agreement now displayed on every screen reflected a coherent structure across both language versions. Conditional clauses had been aligned. Governance mechanisms had been clarified. Financial distribution logic had been corrected to match the original Japanese intent. What had started as a high-value negotiation had now become a case study in how easily complexity can hide instability when assumptions go unchecked. Jonathan Pierce stood near the center of the room, no longer focused on the mechanics of the contract, but on the sequence of events that had led them here. His expression was controlled, but his attention had shifted fully to Alyssa Morgan. She stood calmly near the side of the table, still wearing her black apron, still visually indistinguishable from the service staff she had been earlier that evening, yet no longer defined by that role in the minds of anyone present. One of the senior attorneys finally closed his laptop slowly. The agreement is now structurally consistent, he said. We can proceed with confidence after final administrative validation. A quiet sense of resolution moved through the room. Not celebration, but closure. The tension that had filled the space for hours began to dissolve into structured silence. Jonathan took a slow step forward. His voice, when he spoke, was lower than before, but more deliberate. This outcome changed because of you, he said, looking directly at Alyssa. The room did not interrupt. No one corrected him. No one added commentary. Alyssa met his gaze without hesitation. I only pointed out what was already there, she replied. The simplicity of her answer created a silence that felt different from all the ones before it. This was not uncertainty. It was recognition settling into place. Jonathan studied her for a long moment, then turned slightly toward the table as if organizing his thoughts. We built this entire structure assuming accuracy from the start, he said, more to himself than to the room. But accuracy only exists when it is verified, not assumed. The senior legal advisor nodded slowly. That is correct, he said. Jonathan looked back at Alyssa again. How long have you been analyzing legal and financial language like this? He asked. Alyssa paused briefly before answering. Long enough to recognize when something does not align, she said. There was no exaggeration in her tone, no attempt to elevate her role beyond what she believed it to be. Yet the impact of her presence in that moment was already irreversible. One of the international advisors finally spoke, his tone reflective. This entire negotiation could have concluded differently if this discrepancy had not been identified, he said. Jonathan did not disagree. Instead, he nodded once. The acknowledgement carried more weight than any formal statement. The room slowly began to transition out of crisis mode. Documents were secured. Systems were saved. Final checks were completed. The negotiation that had nearly collapsed was now stabilized, but not unchanged. It had been fundamentally altered by a single moment of observation that no one had anticipated. As the room began to empty, Jonathan remained for a few seconds longer. Alyssa moved toward the exit with the rest of the staff, but he spoke before she could leave completely. Alyssa, she turned. He paused briefly, then continued. If you are open to it, I would like you to join our strategic review team. The words were not framed as a favor. They were framed as recognition of capability. Alyssa did not respond immediately. She looked at him for a moment, then at the room that had just witnessed her shift from invisible presence to central influence. I will consider it, she said finally. Jonathan nodded. Once. That is all I ask. The moment passed without ceremony, but its significance remained. Alyssa stepped out into the hallway, leaving behind the glass-walled conference room where $500 million had nearly shifted in the wrong direction, and where perception itself had quietly changed its structure. Inside, Jonathan remained for a moment longer, looking at the finalized agreement displayed on the screen. The deal was complete, but something more lasting had already taken shape, not in the contract, but in the understanding that value is often present long before it is recognized, and that the most important voices are not always the ones expected to speak first.